All right, then I want to thank you all very much for your donations tonight and for being here tonight to celebrate literacy together. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker, our guest of honor. Yes, I am, as some of you know, and maybe not all of you know, but I am a storyteller. And very often I am asked after a program, do you write your stories? And the answer is no. I consider myself an interpreter of stories. But our speaker tonight creates stories. And then he tells them, puts them down on paper so we all can enjoy the stories. You don't have to have the storyteller right there to tell you the story. With driving narrative and incredible characters and realistic dialogue that just draws you into the excitement of his stories. An international best-selling author, and with his wife, Michelle, co-founder of this wonderful philanthropic organization, Wish You Well Foundation. They support literacy efforts across this country. I cannot think of a better fit. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. David Baldacci.
Well, thank you for coming out tonight. I'm not sure I'd come out to see me, so very kind of you. My wife and I have been involved in literacy since really the beginning. 25 years ago, we formed the Wish You Well Foundation. And I like to think of ourselves as sort of an ATM for literacy across the country. We get probably 1,000 grant applications from across the country every year. Small organizations, large organizations, public school systems who have no money in their budgets for books or libraries anymore. That seems to be a growing trend, an alarming trend. But if you think about it, how much is it worth to all of you if we could get rid of homelessness, poverty, hunger, and crime in this country? Because if you solve literacy, that's what will happen to this country. I think it's priceless. I would pay any amount to have that happen. So thank you for coming out to support this wonderful organization. I was here a long time ago. I've been doing this a long time. It's great to be back. I know that you've had a lot of challenges in this area lately. The country's had a lot of challenges as well, but when people come together through bad times, they tend to get through it. You know, you come out the other end, you might get a little bruised, a little battered, but you come out the other end. If you have to go through bad times, it's really good not to go through them alone. Human beings are social creatures, and we seek out each other during bad times. And that's when you can prove what a good friend really is. It's easy to be a good friend when times are great. Yeah, I'll be at the party, no problem. You know, when times are bad, that's when true friendship, true family is measured. I just came out of a book tour for Strangers in Time. I started out in New York, I went to Connecticut, New Jersey, flew to Chicago, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, some other places. I don't remember, but it was a great tour, and I enjoyed it very much. I don't really have to tour anymore, but I'm part of this ecosystem, you know, books and publishers and writers and readers, bookstores. And like any other ecosystem, one element of it doesn't support the ecosystem. What happens to the ecosystem? It dies. So that's why I still like to get out on the road and tour, and I love to meet readers and spend time with them. I love being around people who love books. Now, on book tour, I get a lot of questions from people. One I get more than any other is, so what is it like to be a #1 best-selling novelist? And I know the way they ask the question, they want some sort of glib Hollywood answer, like I get up at noon every day. You know, I have a favorite sweater that I wear. I have a small dog that I carry under my arm. And I go down to my study and I have a bevy of people waiting to write down everything I might say. My life is not like that at all. Just ask my wife. I go to a cool event, I come home, I'm telling her about it. She's like, yeah, it's trash night. Get on it. if you've read any of my novels, you'll know that I only write about strong, independent women for a couple of reasons. One, I have never met a damsel in distress in my life. And I am married to a force of nature, so that's why I write what I write. So I would answer that question, what it was like to be a best-selling novelist, and I tell people stories about my kids when they were little. Now, it's difficult to describe to your daughter when she's 5 years old that what her dad does as a writer. You know, it just doesn't connect up. I do remember that she used to see me signing my name in books. That was sort of my job, signing my name in books. And when she went to elementary school, they had Parents' Career Day. And my daughter said, "You can never come to school for Parents' Career Day." And I said, why not? She said, "Because they don't like you writing your name in books." Fair enough. I never went to my kids' Parents' Career Day at school. When I sold my first book, and I'd been a lawyer up until that point, and so I was gone early in the morning, got late at night, and we had a cleaning crew that came to the townhouse that we lived in back then in South Alexandria, and I sold my first book, and I loved the practice of law, and then all of a sudden I'm there every day. So when the cleaning crew comes, they see me, I'm in a ball cap and sweatpants. Week after week they come, and there I am. And finally, the foreman for the crew comes up to me and said, "You know, we're really sorry for you. We're really sorry. We took up a collection because you obviously lost your job, and here's the money." And I was so touched by that. I mean, it was so endearing. I kept the money, obviously, but I don't want to pass that up. But life has changed a lot since then. I travel a lot, you know, I'm flying around different places, and this last tour I was flying quite a bit, and it was reminding me of a story that happened to me years ago, well over 15 years ago. I was on a plane at 35,000 feet, minding my own business, and the pilot comes out of the cockpit. This is before 9/11, and he motioned a flight attendant over, and she came over, and they're talking, and then she goes and gets some sheaf of papers, brings it back, they're looking down the list, and they both look up at me. And I didn't know what was going on. I thought maybe did I get an extra bag of peanuts that I wasn't supposed to get, or a blanket, or a pillow. And then the flight attendant walked off, sort of gave me a look that was sort of weird. And then even weirder, the pilot came over and sat down next to me, looking very anxious and worried and all the things you never want to see on a pilot's face if you're flying on the same plane that he's flying. And finally he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure, but if we're going down, can I text my wife? Because I'd like to say goodbye." He goes, No, the plane's fine, we're good. I said, "That's great to know. What's your question?" And he just hemmed and hawed, and finally he just blurted out, "I got a great idea for a thriller. Do you want to hear it?" I have a very vivid imagination. That scenario never occurred to me. I don't know about all of you, but I really like two pilots flying every plane that I'm on. So I made a deal with him. I said, "You know, if you get back up in the cockpit with your buddy and you land the plane safely, I'll stay behind. You can tell me your story." He was like, "Awesome, thank you so much." We went to the cockpit, we landed, everybody deplaned except for me. He came, and with great enthusiasm and great embellishment, he told me his idea for a thriller. I wish it had been better. Because there's absolutely nothing redeeming about this idea at all, nothing. But I didn't want to tell him that because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. I was raised to be a very polite, respectful person. So I was sort of racking my brain, what can I say to him to let him down gently? And finally I said, "You know what? I think that you're doing with your life exactly what you were meant to do with your life." Most people can't fly a plane. I can't. It's really difficult. That landing is one of the best I've ever had. On the flip side, other things being equal, not everyone can be a writer. And I think you may fall in that camp. And then I just grabbed my bag and I ran like hell. And ever since then, every plane I've gotten on, if the cockpit door is open, I do a little turkey peek inside to see if the guy's flying the plane, and I just don't get on it, if he's ever going to get on it. Now, I have inscribed over the last nearly 30 years, I have inscribed lots of weird stuff in books. I've signed things that weren't books at book signings. I won't give you a list, but interesting. Let's just leave it at that. But probably the most unusual inscription request I ever had was a number of years ago. A young woman was in line. She came up, she put the book down in front of me, and she said, I need to give you a little backstory about what I want you to write in the book. And I said, okay. She goes, my name is Amy. The person I want you to write the book to, his name is Tom. He's a big fan of yours. He's read everything you've written. Now, Tom has asked me to marry him 3 times. Amy didn't tell me what she told Tom on those 3 occasions. I could only assume it was no. So here's what Amy wanted me to write. To Tom, Amy loves you with all of her heart. Amy would love to share her life with yours. Amy accepts your proposal of marriage. And then Amy said, and you know, whatever else you want to write. She said, well, you do it, it's kind of important. I said, yeah, I can see it's important. So I started writing, and it was like all of a sudden I hit this tipping point where I brought to bear all my gifts as a storyteller. I wrote 1 page, I turned the page, I wrote down another page. I wrote 3 pages on this woman, and I have to tell you, by the end of it, she was not merely Amy, a mortal woman. She was like Saint Amy. Tom never had a chance. So she read what I'd written. She was laughing, crying. She hugged me, and as she's walking away, I called after her and I said, you tell Tom he's one hell of a lucky man. And she said, I will. And then Amy, a woman I didn't even know, walked out of my life. And then I started to think about what I'd just done. And I really started to pray that Amy is actually as wonderful as I wrote that she was. Because if she ends up ruining this man's life, that guy is coming for me, you know? Not ever going to do that again. Now, I've gotten a lot of fan letters over the years, and when I first started out, they were actually real letters. There wasn't any email. That's how old I am. I'm old enough. I went to the University of Virginia School of Law. I went back there recently, and the new dean, so you know, this is the dean of the law school, one of the best law schools in the country, came up to me and said, you gave the commencement speech at my graduation. I don't know why I said that. It just popped into my head for some reason. Anyway, so I'm old enough to have gotten real letters in the mail. So my publisher would collect them at the house in New York, and they would ship them down by bags to my office in Virginia, and I would try to read as many of them as I could. Now it's all email, and there's just so many of them. I have people who handle that. I can't read them all anymore. The one I remember the most was not actually a fan letter. At least I didn't think it was, because it was addressed to Dear Mr. Disgusting. And she wrote, I can't believe that you took an American political scandal and wrote about it for money. You repulsed me. Now, as it went on further, she was writing about Absolute Power, my very first novel. In Absolute Power, the president is not a very nice person. He thinks he's above the law and does a lot of really weird things. Just give me a second. So anyway, here's what she thought. She thought that I had based Absolute Power on the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky scandal. So I thought, well, I can fix this. So I wrote her back. And I said, if you look at the copyright page of Absolute Power, it was published in January of 1996. I sold it in November of 1994. I started writing it in 1990, years before anyone had even heard of Monica Lewinsky. So therefore, I could not have written a book based on an actual event that occurred after my book was published. And I signed it sincerely, not Mr. Disgusting. I thought that would have carried the day. It did not. A week later, I got another fan letter from her. I knew right away my argument had not carried the day because it was addressed to Dear Still Mr. Disgusting. And it was only 1 sentence long, and all she said was, that proves nothing. Strangers in Time. It's set in 1944 in London. 1 million books have been written about World War II. And I had to try to figure out what I wanted to write that would make mine sort of different from others that have come before. I've been an Anglophile for a long time. I cut my teeth as a young reader, reading the likes of a lot of British writers, everybody from H.G. Wells to Conan Doyle to Agatha Christie, Charles Dickens. That world really rocked my boat. I loved that stuff. And I've been there many times. I've been to the UK, I've been to Australia, New Zealand. I just love that world. And I remember my wife gave me a journal probably about 13 or 14 years ago for Christmas. And I have to say, never give blank paper to a writer on a major holiday because they will disappear. She did the same thing to me for a book I wrote called A Calamity of Souls that came out last year. She gave me a journal, and I went to my office on Christmas Day in 2012 and wrote at the top, A Calamity of Souls. I don't know where the title came from, it just hit me. And now I know that there's a pattern that my wife is trying to get rid of me on Christmas Day, and it seems to be working. So Strangers in Time is 3 characters. It's Molly Wakefield, wealthy young girl from the West End, Chelsea. Charlie Matters, a poor lad from the East End, Bethnal Green. And roughly in the middle, Ignatius Oliver, bookseller in the Strand. But for the war, they never would have met. Never would have met. So Charlie has very little, Molly has a lot, Oliver has more than Charlie has. And during the course of the novel, Molly loses everything she has, Charlie loses what little he has, and the 3 of them have to come together to try to survive the war. Something they probably could not have done separately, individually. But together they had a chance. And I thought by focusing on those 3 people, that's the story I wanted to tell. If you think about it, World War II is probably the most classic example of the totality of human experience. You have good and evil and bracketing every human endeavor and experience on the spectrum in between. Every single one of them. So if we learn the lessons from that, then unfortunately, most of the people who experienced World War II are no longer with us. And those lessons are fading fast. In fact, you will find a lot of people in this country under the age of 50 who have really little idea about World War II was even about, what it was being fought over. And I think when you don't know history, history repeats itself in really bad ways. That's why history is so important. So that's the book I wanted to write. And the title comes from the fact that it's like strangers in time, because this is in the past, but strangers in the nick of time. If you think about it, important decisions you've had to make in your life, it's not so much about the decisions you make, it's who you were around at the time you had to make those decisions. Who was there to influence you one way or the other? Because if it had been this person or that person, your decisions might have been very different. You might have taken another path, traveled down another road, and your life could be diametrically different than what it is today. And that's why it's so important that, particularly in bad times, to seek out people that you can trust and rely on to get through those bad times. It makes it a little bit easier. I got a bunch of film projects in the works. I've sold like 6 different series to television, different platforms and movies. The 620 Man is a series I wrote. It's at Netflix for a series. Memory Man, Amos Decker is at Amazon Studios. Camel Club is at NBC Universal. I've sold True Blue, King of Maxwell, again, the Will Roby series. So I have a masterclass online where I talk about writing, but I also talk about the business of writing, and I talk about film rights in particular. People say, well, you want to have complete control over the film project. I said, no. Here's my litmus test for that. You never want to have so much control over a film or television project such that if it fails, they can blame and sue you. And as a former lawyer, I can tell you that they will. And I do not want to be like in a lawsuit with Warner Brothers for the next 25 years of my life. So it's much better to sort of find people who share the vision of what you want to tell for a particular story. If they have writers on board, I sit down and talk to the writers before I even sign the deal. And if I'm comfortable with that, then I go ahead and do it. It's apples and oranges. I've adapted one of my own films for a movie, and you take a 400-page novel and you have to trim it down to about a 100-page screenplay, and you have to decide what little piece of the book do you want to film. If you took a 400-page novel and you turn it into a movie with leaving nothing out, it would be about 6 hours long. Now, people will watch a movie that is 6 hours long, but it has to have 2 critical elements. One is a very young, beautiful couple falling in love, and the second is a large ship sinking for a really long time. And if you have those two elements, you will sit your butt in that chair for 6 hours and you will watch it happen. Now, I grew up at the tail end of Jim Crow in the old capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. I grew up with racism all around me. And that was the world, a very black and white world, that I was born into. And it's the reason I wrote A Calamity of Souls, which is very autobiographical. I'm on the board of the Mark Twain House. I mean, I've been a Twainiac for 35 years. I started reading Mark Twain when I was in high school, one of the greatest iconic American writers of all time. The first American writer to really speak like Americans speak. All writers before him sort of spoke and wrote about it in the English vernacular, British English. Twain was sui generis. He was absolutely unique. Twain was the most traveled person of his generation. He circumnavigated the globe 3 times on his book tours. He was also the most quoted person of his generation. If you needed a pithy quote, Mark Twain was there for you. In fact, being on the board of the Mark Twain House about 4 years ago, I said, you know what, we need to have Twain on Twitter. And they started doing that. So when crazy stuff happened in the world, there was a Mark Twain quote from 140 years ago that was spot on, which shows you that history does repeat itself. Now, one of Mark Twain's greatest quotes is this. It's a very important one. Travel is fatal to prejudice. Meaning, if you go to where people actually live and you see how they live, you're going to realize they're just like you. No matter what they look like, they're just like you. Now, most people can't travel the world, and I certainly couldn't. I never traveled out of Virginia, out of Richmond when I was a young boy. But I did the next best thing. My parents took my brother and sister and I to the library every week, and I checked out as many books as I could, and I feel like I traveled the world without a plane ticket or a passport. And I saw people who didn't look like me, speak like me, learn like me, pray like me, think like me, but I instantly knew we shared that common core of humanity. You know, when dictators take over a country, the first thing they do is shutter and burn all the libraries and the books. They don't want information in the hands of people, because information is power. That's really all you need to know about the importance of books and reading in our freedoms. You know, there's a reason Jefferson said he can't live without books. If you can live without books, it will not be in a free society, because books won't be there. For me, libraries represent the very best of people, the wisdom and the knowledge and the creativity and the spark and the diversity of humankind. That does not divide, but unites with a common and shared purpose. It does not instill fear, but instead educates and inspires. If you look at it this way, if you're a consistent reader, you will meet far more people in books than you ever will in real life. And in books, you can go to places that you will never go in real life. And in books, you will go to places that you can't go in real life, like the past and the future. We have 2 things that bedevil us as a society: ignorance and intolerance. They're the evil twins of history. You can't have one without the other. Ignorance is like the blood supply to the cancer that is intolerance. You get rid of an ignorance, intolerance has to die. It has no more blood supply. The best way to destroy ignorance, you pick up a book and you read. That's what destroys ignorance. And intolerance dies. And that's what happened to me in Jim Crow, Virginia, when everybody was telling me that the black and white world was the way it was supposed to be. I ventured into the world of books, and that brought love, knowledge, and wisdom to my heart. I've always felt like that books are like body armor against bigotry. Because at least when I was growing up, the examples I was given, those people don't look like you. You should be scared of them, afraid of them. They're not like you. We need to keep this separate. We need to have a wall. People like to build walls between people. My solution to that was, oh no, they're not boogeymen to me. I've met them on the page. I know where they are. I don't fear them, I love them. because they're just like me. Because reading also grants you the most important human attribute that there is, empathy. Why is it the most important? Because it leads to all the best in humanity, including things like love. Conversely, the opposite, the lack of empathy in your life, leads to all the worst in humanity. It makes people cruel and mean and territorial and divisive. So when you open a book, when you learn to read at a high level, you are not simply seizing entertainment. You are taking measured steps that will enlighten and broaden and add depth to your humanity. And that in turn lifts all of us up. Remember, we only began to leave the dark ages behind when this guy named Gutenberg invented the printing press, where books became widely available. And that led to a better, kinder. We've lost sight of how powerful that word is, kindness, and an enlightened existence for all of us. And I think that's the world we all want to live in. I think that's what we're all here tonight, supporting this amazing organization that is trying to lift up people individual by individual, because when that water rises, all boats go up as well. And everyone's life will be better because of it. Now back to the comedy portion of my program tonight. I wrote a book years ago called The Winner. And in The Winner, my villain Jackson figured out how to fix the United States National Lottery. He didn't do it by paying off people on the inside of the lottery, because he was an individual, he had to do it on his own. So he did it through science. More particularly, he did it through chemistry. The cool thing about chemistry is when you take element A and you combine it with element B, you don't get C as a result 80 or 90% of the time. You get it 100% of the time, which is the cool thing about chemistry. There's an absolutism to it. I remember when I wrote the book and I sent the draft up to my agent, I had the lottery payout back then as being $180 million. And my agent called up and said, I love the book, it's terrific, but come on, it'll never get up that high. So if you ever read the book, you'll know that the payout is $100 million, which my agent thought was still too high. Now, years ago, when the Mega Lotto went to $1.8 billion, I called him up. He was like, yeah, I know. So I wrote the book, came out, everybody loved it. And, life goes on. I'm working on other books. And 2 years after the book came out, I got a call from a reporter at La Repubblica, which is the largest daily newspaper in Rome, Italy. He said, Mr. Baldacci, have you been following the Italian National Lottery scandal? And I said, why no, I must have missed that somehow. He said, well, if someone figured out how to fix the Italian National Lottery and did it in a way that is virtually identical to what you wrote about in The Winner. Would you like to comment on that, sir? I said, well, I have a couple of reactions to that. My first is, that's bad, very, very bad. I would never encourage anyone to fix the lottery. That's a felony. You go to prison for that. Don't do it. Second reaction, that is like the coolest thing anyone has ever told me in my whole life. It works. I've been validated. But please do not go out and buy a copy of The Winner and then go try to fix the lottery down in North Carolina. They will find you. I will be sad, and trust me, you'll be even sadder than I am. Now, I'm Italian American. A lot of people think Baldacci is Irish. I don't know. I'm Italian American. And my grandfather came over through Ellis Island at the turn of the last century and lived in New York for a little bit of time. He was a big, striking man, 6'4", very handsome. His name was Amedeo Vittorio Giovanni Baldacci. And he didn't want to stay in New York City because for a lot of Western Europeans, particularly a lot of Italians, they found New York City too cold. And a lot of them back in the early 1900s, they got on a train and they went south. And they got off at the first town in the south, and back then it was Richmond, Virginia. There was a large Italian population in Richmond, Virginia just because people don't want to be cold. And my grandfather took the train down. He met my grandmother at a boarding house where her mother owned it. They fell in love. They had 8 kids, including my father. My grandfather was this entrepreneur. He had lots of businesses in Richmond. But Amedeo Vittorio Giovanni Baldacci, nobody in Richmond could pronounce any of those names. So everybody in Richmond called my grandfather Mike. Who the hell knows why? I don't know why. Nobody could ever tell me why. Now, my grandfather passed away before I was even born. I'd heard a lot of stories about him, never had the opportunity to meet him. And my dad had always wanted to go back to the village where my grandfather was born in Barga, which is in Tuscany, Italy, one of the most beautiful parts in Italy. And the closest my dad got was Egypt. He fought in World War II, and I have a picture of my dad, 17 years old, in his navy whites, kneeling in front of the Sphinx. I have it hanging in my office. I look at that every day when I'm in the office. Quite something. He never made it to Barga. And the year my dad passed away, one of the biggest regrets of my life was that I did not go with my father to Barga. And that's an opportunity I was never going to have again. So I made a resolution myself that I was going to go to Barga for my dad. And we made all the arrangements. We were going to travel over there with another family who had kids about our kids' ages back then. And before we left, I got an email from the mayor of Barga. And he said, Mr. Baldacci, I read in a magazine that you were going to be spending your holiday in Italy. I was like, that's creepy. He said, I'd love for you to come to Barga. I could take you to lunch and show you where your grandfather was born and show you the town. I was like, terrific. We were going to come anyway. So we made the date. We were staying in a villa a couple of hours away. And the day came for us to go to Barga. We got in a couple of cars. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to drive in Italy. It is not easy to do that. And back then, there were no cell phones with GPS, so you had to have this thing you plug into the cigarette lighter in your car like a little garment. And it's sort of the same system they used to have over here, Hertz Never Lost. It's pretty much the same thing. Italy, a slightly different name. They call it Hertz Always Lost in Italy. And about 30 minutes outside of Barga, our system went on holiday, and we never heard from it again. Now, I'm a very punctual person. I was a trial lawyer for a decade. It's beaten to your head. Don't be late, don't be late. So I'm always early. We were late already for lunch. And my wife is trying to read paper maps in Italian, which is very difficult. And finally, we get to this crossroads where there's some buildings and some people. And I looked at her and I said, do you think this is Barga? Do you think we're here? And she looked out of the window and said, well, considering there's a 14-foot tall poster of you on the wall over there, it's a pretty good bet we're in Barga. So we noticed all this activity and policemen directing traffic, and I rolled the window down and I got the attention of an officer. He came over, and in my broken Italian and his broken English, I asked him what's going on. He goes, oh, it's David Baldacci Day. Park over there. I slowly rolled my window back up, and I slowly turned to look at my wife, and she's giving me, every husband will know, she's giving me the wife death stare that if you look at it too long, actually will melt your bones. I found. And she said, David Baldacci Day, are you freaking kidding me? I said, honey, I had no idea. Liar! So we get out of the car, and Barga is a walled city, much like Lucca, which is a more famous place in Italy. It's a walled city. And outside of the wall is New Barga, which dates from the 16th century. That's new for Italians. Inside the wall is Old Barga, that dates from the 11th century. And the gates open, and out marches the mayor. He has the Italian and American flags draped over his body. Behind him is a marching band. Behind them are all these videographers and journalists. And behind them, apparently, is everyone who lives in Barga. They're flying the American flag over the city for the first time since 1945, when the Americans liberated it from the Germans. So we're greeted, laughing, hugging, and all that, and off we go. We take a tour of the city where my grandfather was born, the Duomo, the town center, the courthouse. I did a book signing at one of the bookstores. We had lunch. It was me, the mayor, family, friends, 900 new friends. Some of the best fried meatballs I've ever had in my life, though. I have to recommend that. And we had like 5 gallons of gelato, and time was going on. Hours were passing. And we were staying at a villa like 2 hours away, a villa with views. To get a villa with views in Italy, you got to go up. And you're going around these little roads with no guardrails. I did not want to drive that at night because I didn't want to go off a cliff and die. It would have been really bad. And my wife said, we got to get going, so tell the mayor, thank you, but we're out of here. So I went over to the mayor and I said, Mr. Mayor, thank you so much. This has been like, and he goes, Mr. Baldacci, now it is time for you to give your grand speech in the center courtyard of the city. I look down, I'm wearing a polo shirt, flip-flops, and shorts. So off we march to the grand courtyard, and the band plays one more song, and the mayor gets up and he starts giving us gifts. The first was like a lifetime supply of locally pressed olive oil. A lovely gift, a little difficult to get back on the plane with that. A little more than 4 ounces. An oil painting by a local artist. A genealogical chart like this big that charts the Baldacci family from the 11th century to my grandfather's generation, where I learned about siblings of my grandfather I never even knew existed because they never immigrated to the US. I've got that framed and hanging in my office in Virginia. A journal out of the town archives that had belonged to my ancestor, Pietro Baldacci. He started writing in the 1630s. And back then, because paper was scarce, if he passed away and there was still paper left, it was handed down. And the last entries in that journal are from the 1880s, all ancestors of mine. And then the mayor said, okay, the Baldacci Bambinos, come up and get your swag to my kids. My daughter back then was around 15, a teenage girl. I will leave it at that. She just graduated from law school a couple of weeks ago. I'm very proud of her. She was out of school for a while, traveled the world, worked in different places, decided she could be a better advocate for marginalized communities, went back and did a law degree, and now she's going to be out there helping people. Back then, she was a 15-year-old girl. That's all I cared about. And she hated attention. She didn't like to be the focus, and so everybody's eyes are on her. The sea of people parted. She's walking up. She's not looking at the mayor. She's not looking at mom. She's looking at me. And she's giving me the look that is translated as being this. You have ruined my life. Now, my son was 12. This is how he went up to get his stuff. I know I'm wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So then it was my turn to give my grand speech, and I got up and I said, no, even though it's August, it feels like Christmas, because there's outpouring of family and friendship and gifts and warmth. Probably the most magical moment I'm ever going to experience in life, other than my marriage and the birth of my kids. And then, as we were leaving, a friend of ours who traveled to Italy with us said, David, you have to come over and meet these 4 gentlemen. So he directed me to a bench where these 4 elderly men are sitting. I remember the soft felt caps. They had these canes. Each had a copy of one of my books in Italian. The youngest, I later learned, was 85. The oldest was 104. As I approached, they all stood up, took off their caps, and they gave a little bow of respect. And I turned to my friend and I said, oh my God, this is wonderful. Who are they? He goes, these are all Baldacci. Some of them came from different countries today to meet you. So being Italians, we were all started to cry and look around for more food to eat. Years later, a book travel company called Lonely Planet approached me and said, we're doing an anthology of travel stories by famous writers. Do you have one you'd like to contribute? And I said, yeah, I think I got one for you. So the story I just told you is the one that I wrote, and I entitled it Coming Home, because even though I'd never been to Barga before, in every significant, substantive, visceral way, it was like I had been coming home to Barga on that day, back to a place that felt good and home to me. As a writer, you meet a lot of interesting people over time. 4 of the last 5 presidents are fans of mine, have read a lot of my books and gotten to meet them. I know. Why do I do this to myself? I was in Australia on the program like the Good Morning America show, and they said, so do you think you'll ever sign a book for the current president? And I said, well, he's very famously said he doesn't read, so I don't think that's going to happen. So anyway, I got a fan letter years ago from a woman you probably heard of. Her name is Barbara Bush. And she wrote and said, George and I are big fans. We have this Literacy Foundation. We'd love for you to come to Houston and be one of our presenters. And so Michelle and I went down and met them and became friends with them. We bonded over a love of books and reading and the power the power of being able to read at a high level. I experienced that for myself. I would not be here today as a writer if not a reader as a young person. Books had not just sort of enveloped me in my life. I know how powerful that can be. Well, they invited us up to their place in Maine. They have a place in Kennebunkport, Walker's Point. And we went up there, and it was my wife, my kids. They were probably, I guess our daughter was maybe 6, our son was maybe 3 or 4. Our in-laws came, my wife's parents came. Now, Bush is a big boater, was a big boater. This is Bush 41. And I'm a big boater. I love boats, too. We have a lake house in Virginia, and we taught our kids how to ski and sail and all that stuff. I just love being on the water. So we went down the little cove they have at Walker's Point. Bush had a beautiful 32-foot center console fountain boat with triple engines, like 800 horsepower, just a pretty machine. And he was on the boat, and he said, "Hey, you guys want to go for a boat ride?" And I was like, "Heck yeah, let's do it." So we all got on the boat. I'm in the bow with my father-in-law, who, just remember this, he used to be in the Navy. That'll be important later on. That's called foreshadowing. The payoff will come later. My son and me. President, the cockpit, my wife sitting next to him, Secret Service agent standing behind President Bush. In the stern seats are Bush granddaughters, maybe like 6, and our daughter. So Bush stands up and said, "Okay, there's only one rule in this boat. It's an important rule, listen up. But anytime, anyone has a problem with the speed of this marine vessel, all you have to do is raise your hand." Everybody understand that rule? Great. Turns the boat around, hits the throttle, we blow out into the open ocean, 2-foot seas, we're doing 30 knots, such that the entire 32-foot boat is coming out of the water. You can hear all 3 props go, right? And because of the law of physics, I'm sitting in the bow, I'm being levitated out of my seat. With each pass, I've got my son, who has a life jacket on, crushed under my arm. My Navy father-in-law is holding on the gunwales going, "We're gonna die." Thanks, Dad, that's very reassuring. So the third time that I was levitated out of my seat and my butt came back down and hit, I raised my hand. And Bush looks over the cockpit windshield. "Oh, faster?" Now we're doing 40 knots in like 2.5 chop. The only reason we stopped was because Maine is pretty obvious, has a very rocky coastline. And there was a bunch of rock out there. And seals were sliding up and down all over and playing and having a great time. We stopped to watch the seals. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, ever since then, I have had the softest spot in my heart for seals. Proven. And by the way, there was supposed to be a Secret Service chase boat behind us. The boat they'd had could not keep up with them, so they had confiscated a boat from the DEA who had taken it from South American drug runners. I'm not kidding, I saw this boat. It was in the cove, black and tricked out like you would not believe. I couldn't even see that boat. It was so far behind us. So then Bush says, "Okay, I'm gonna take you down the coast and show you my sister's house." And the Secret Service agent hears this. He's back in, he's linked into HQ back at Walker's Point. He's listening, speaking, listening, and hears Bush say that. He started to, President Bush, "It's not high tide yet, sir. Remember what happened last time." So after, being levitated out of my seat, I said, "So what happened last time?" He said, "Well, it wasn't high tide yet. Had the Canadian Prime Minister Mulroney on with us. Boat hit a rock and caught on fire." So bad, very, very bad. So here's how we navigated the inlet. My father-in-law is hanging off the starboard side, calling out rocks. I'm hanging out the port side, calling out rocks. "Got a rock over here, sir? Okay. Got a rock over here? Okay." We made it out of the inlet without blowing up, which is great. And then Bush says, "Okay, we're going to head on back to Walker's Point." Secret Service agent hears this. "President Bush, there are swimmers in the cove, sir. Swimmers in the cove at Walker's Point. Remember what happened last time." I did not have the will inside my body to ask him what had happened last time. So we go blowing back into the cove, made the turn coming in. The cove is not much bigger than this room. At the rear of the wall is a jagged rock sticking up out of the water. That's like the point of no return for any marine vessel. And we're heading for that wall at speed, and we're not slowing down. And I'm in the bow, and I'm going to feel it first. I got my son again crushed under my arm, my Navy father-in-law. We are really going to die this time. I turn back around, and the wall just keeps coming, and we're actually accelerating a little bit. And I'm just wondering what is going to happen here. And then I hear the Secret Service agent scream out, "Everybody on this boat, hold the hell on now!" So I turn, and he's braced himself on the boat. He's got a hand on my daughter, a hand on the Bush granddaughter. His eyes are closed, and I'm pretty sure he's praying. Never want to see a Secret Service agent outside of the church ever doing that. And I turn back around, and the wall's still coming, and I'm like, well, this is going to be an fascinating obituary. And at the very last moment, Bush just rips the wheel of the boat, and we go up like this. And I could have scooped up the Atlantic if I wanted to, and the boat does a 180. And then all of a sudden, the stern seats are facing the wall, and the bow is pointing out towards the ocean, and we just stop like this. And then Bush stands up and says, "I hope you had fun. You were never in any real danger, and hope you come back." So we took the boat over to the dock, and they tied it up, and we're getting off the boat, and everybody's kind of staggering, In the Secret Service agent, I knew this guy. I signed a bunch of books for him while I was up there. So I turned to him and I said, hey, Jack, you got a minute? He goes, yeah. I said, maybe like over here? We can talk in private over here? He goes, yeah, sure. So we walked over, and I turned to face him. I said, he said, "What's up?" I said, "What's up?" "What was that, Jack?" He said, "Oh, you mean the boat ride?" I said, "Yeah, the boat ride." "What do you want me to do about it?" He's the president. I was like, that is the only thing you could have said that would have defamed my anger. So there's a little knoll overlooking the cove, and Mrs. Bush and my mother-in-law, who was a genius because she said, "I'm not going on the boat." I walked up, or rather staggered up there, and as I'm passing Mrs. Bush, she turns and looks at me and says, "You're never going to go out with him again, are you?" I said, "Mrs. Bush, all due respect, not a chance in hell I'm never going to get on a boat with that man again." She said, "Yeah, I stopped going years ago." But then she added something very intriguing. She said, "If you hang around for a few minutes, I think you're going to see something that might make you feel better." I said, "Well, okay." So I went and stood next to her. ESPN was up there filming a documentary that included Bush 41. He played baseball at Yale. He had met Babe Ruth. His son co-owned, partly owned Texas Rangers. And there were two really well-known anchors. This is the late 90s, a man and a woman on ESPN that you would all have known back then. And they went down to the dock. And Bush was still in the boat and talking to him. And because words carry over water, we could hear what they were saying. And then I hear Bush ask them, "Hey, you guys want me to pull you on a tube?" And the male anchor said, "I don't know, President Bush, is it fun?" And Bush said, "It's a lot of fun." And the woman had a really good question. She goes, "Well, President Bush, we didn't bring any bathing suits, so I don't think we can." He goes, "Not a problem. Go up to the bathhouse. I buy them from Walmart by the dozen. They're still in the plastic wrap. Find your size. We'll be waiting for you down here." So they go running up to get their bathing suits, and Mrs. Bush and I are kind of looking at each other. And while they're getting changed, Bush has his guys tie a hot dog tube to the back of the boat. Now, a hot dog tube is not stable even in a bathtub, much less the Atlantic Ocean. So the two anchors, and they're beautiful people, perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect teeth, everything's perfect about these people. And they're perky too, they're running down to the dock, they're so excited. It's like, first day of school and, it's recess, all is right with the world. So they get on the tube, and Bush pulls him out into the cove. He doesn't even pull him into the Atlantic. He's in the cove. He starts circling the boat and circling the boat and circling the boat and building the wake and building the wake and building the wake. And at the last second, when the wake's like 2 feet, he slams the throttle down. He blows the fountain boat across that wake. And those two anchors, ironically enough, are launched into outer space. To this day, I still remember my mother-in-law, Mrs. Bush, and me going like this. And when they came back down, there's no tube there. And they went into and then under the Atlantic Ocean, which even in August, it's Maine, it was like 50 degrees. So when they came up, they didn't look so pretty. And I have to say, I've never heard a man scream that loud in my life. And Bush, for whatever reason, took a long time to come over and get them. And his guys had to like pull them into the boat like beached whales, you know, they're just laying there. Like. And while this is going on, and they're bringing them back over to the dock, Mrs. Bush finally turns and looks at me and says, "Do you feel better?" And I said, "Yeah, really, I kind of do. I feel really good about myself." Years later, I used to do some stories for USA Today and Parade Magazine. They wanted me to do a story on the Bushes in later years. And I traveled back out with my wife to Walker's Point, knocked on the door. Mrs. Bush answered the door, and she said, "I just want to let you know, George is down at the dock on the boat, if you want to go back out with him again." Now, I'll end with this story. You know, people think, well, you're, this famous writer, you must get recognized in public all the time. Almost never. Being a writer, a celebrity writer, is sort of like an anonymous celebrity. Nobody looks at the dust jacket flap picture. Nobody. They might recognize the name occasionally, but it's sort of anonymous celebrity, which I greatly prefer. I don't want to go out and be mobbed. We're not athletes or actors or, musicians. It's not that same sort of fame. But with that said, even when you are recognized in public, it's not the ego stroke you think it might otherwise be. I was having lunch with my wife somewhere. We were in a booth and having a nice lunch. And you look up from time to time, and I looked across the restaurant, big restaurant, filled with people. There's a man and a woman having lunch, far table. I looked over, and the lady was like laser locked on me, like looking at me like, and it kind of freaked me out. So I looked away, and I thought, you must have misinterpreted that. She's probably looking at something else. So I turned and looked at her again, laser lock. It's like I had a sniper's dot on my forehead. And finally, I just stopped looking. So I'm eating my lunch. A few minutes went by, and then I sensed a presence next to our table. I thought it was our waitress. I looked up. It's the woman. So she pushes me over in the seat and sits there next to me. And she gives me this really odd look and says, "You are who I think you are, aren't you?" Now, I have no idea if this woman is a psychopath. I don't know if she has weapons. And I'm just trying to keep it very calm. I said, "Well, do you read a lot?" She said, "Oh, yes, I do." I said, "Well, okay, then I guess I am who you think I am." And then this woman just completely lost it. She turned and screamed at me. She said, "Never in my whole life did I think I'd have an opportunity to meet you. This is the most magical moment of my life. I can't even process what is happening to me right now." And then she turns and screams all the way across this packed restaurant to, I guess, her husband. And she said, "I was right, Joe. It is John Grisham." I've known John 25 years. We've done a lot of events together. Every time I've asked John to step up and do a charitable event with me, he has. He's a great guy, just a classic Southern gentleman. I think a lot of him, but quite frankly, at that moment in my life, I was not feeling the love for John at all. And my poor wife, to put it delicately, she blew iced tea out of her nose. I did not know that it was possible for a human being to laugh hysterically for 5 minutes. I really didn't, no, I told her, hey, call up Guinness Book, because I think you might have broken the record for that. While I just sat there. And she finally picked herself off the floor and composed herself. She said very politely to the woman, that's the right genre. But the wrong author. And the woman looked mortified. She turned to me again. She goes, oh my God, are you Baldacci? And I said, yeah, I am. Obviously terribly disappointed I was not Monsieur Grisham. This woman turns and screams across the restaurant again to her husband. You were right, Joe. It is the Italian. Thank you very much.